Democratic Congressman from Illinois, Mike Quigley. He is co-chair of the Ukraine caucus. Congressman, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
So first, to this decision by the U.S. To allow Ukraine to use these U.S.-supplied weapons to strike inside Russian territory. The right decision?
Absolutely. What's frustrating, to be quite frank here, is that since the first day of the war, I understand the president has been cautious about escalation, but the request for anything coming from Ukraine was always first met with no. We thought this war would be over in weeks, so we were going to, defensive weapons, small arms for a battle of insurgency, and then every time we went from something else, the long-range firing weapons, tanks, and so forth, the initial answer was always no, and then it gets to yes. And unfortunately, that puts Ukraine behind the schedule of dealing with this. And frankly, I think the Russians game for that.
Do you believe that the risk of escalation is real with a decision like this? Or do you believe, as some Eastern European leaders have told me, that the U.S. exaggerates the risk of escalation with Russia and that Russia takes advantage of that, in effect?
Well, Russia certainly takes advantage of it. I take the risk very seriously, but there's a risk associated with the challenge at hand and why it's so important. We simply can't let a sovereign democratic country be wiped off the face of the earth, and the devastation that's taken place moving forward. And as you know, with the ambitions beyond Ukraine that Putin certainly has. So yes, there is absolutely that risk. But we have to understand that there's a risk of not doing something that goes well beyond Ukraine, to our other allies, and to the U.S. itself.
The criticism of the sort of slow rolling of each of these weapons decisions over the last several months and 2 years is that the U.S. doesn't have a plan for Ukraine to win this war, just in effect to hold the ground that it has now, hold the line, not lose too much territory, defend itself, etc. Do you agree with that criticism?
I think it's had the effect of having that result. I think that, I think that President Biden and those that support Ukraine always wanted them to win and have certainly given a tremendous amount of aid. The slow rolling on some of the issues and the weaponry that we're talking about has had that effect. I think it was valid to remember what President Zelensky said when he spoke to Congress. He said, "Help us win quickly." And I think there's an extra reason to be concerned about that, and that's the battle of attrition. Ukraine's population is a third of Russia, and there's a difference as well with Putin using conscripts and prisoners and be willing to use his people as cannon fodder in this battle, something Ukraine isn't willing to do. That has a very dangerous effect that concerns me, that Putin feels like he can just wait it out and game the U.S. and Western allies and what they are or are not willing to do to win the war.
I want to turn now to the Trump trial and his conviction yesterday. Both Trump and Biden are fundraising off of it. You've run a lot of election campaigns. I'm not asking you to speak for the entire American voting public of 160 million voters, but what is your best sense as to the degree of impact this conviction has on the presidential election? I know there's been some polling that shows that the vast majority of voters, a conviction would not change their minds, but some say yes, and I wonder how much hard data there actually is. What is your political sense of this? Is it impactful?
It is, but in a more subtle way than people may first look at this. It's not going to impact the president's base. It's certainly not going to impact former President Trump's base at all. But look, President Trump won by what? 80,000 votes in 3 states in 2016. So it doesn't take much. And the other part of polling that we don't do well is turnout. So that Nikki Haley voter who's still stuck at what, 19% in a lot of these later primaries, how many of them will stay home? The data I saw that I thought was interesting was those double haters I thought were trending toward Trump And I don't think that's the case anymore. So it may be nuanced, but this is going to be a narrow margined election. And so it won't take much to make a big difference.
Before we go, let me ask you arguably a more difficult question, and that is, are you worried about the precedent here? I'm not asking you to judge the decision of 12 jurors. They listened to the evidence, they did their work, they sent questions back to the judge, and they came to a guilty verdict. That's how the system works. Are you worried, though, that this does lay the groundwork for politicians of each party to attempt to, at least, go after their political opponents via the courts?
There's always that risk, but the opposite of that is perhaps worse. I mean, if you take the opposite argument to, as you would, an illogical extreme, you would never be able to prosecute a president or a former president, regardless of what their crimes are. Yeah. And here, a jury of his peers, decided unanimously in rather short order that the president was guilty. And the protestations this morning by the president, I thought were amusing when he alluded to witnesses that could have rebutted all this. I never criticize a defendant for not testifying themselves. That's their choice. But don't tell us that someone's out there who could have changed this and you didn't even try to do them. So the fact that the reaction was so political instead of assessing this, you've got to respect the rule of law and the justice system. And if anything, this former president should be grateful that he hasn't been held accountable before.
Congressman Mike Quigley, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you. Take care.